Hello, everybody. Welcome to the session. I'll just share my screen. Give me one moment. Okay. Punima, just a heads up if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. All right. So it's a very hot topic today. I'm here to give you an overview on the due diligence regulations for responsible sourcing of gold. The Ministry of Economy published in August the new guideline and the guidances for the due diligence regulations for responsible sourcing of gold. My first take on this. Why gold? Well, gold is a very attractive, extremely attractive vehicle for money laundering, for terrorism financing, because it can be easily moved, hidden, and a lot of illegality is involved in the trading and the sourcing of gold. Now let's see what the guidance says one by one. Well, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development stages 5 steps in the gold supply chain due diligence framework. Today, I'm going to give you an overview of all the 5 steps, and probably later on someday, we could have an in-depth knowledge on each of every steps. Today, I'm just going to give you an overview. So the 5 steps involve establishing an effective governance framework, identification, management, independent third-party audit, annual reporting. Let's see the cycle once. Okay, now this is the cycle which is responsible sourcing due diligence framework. This cycle is a complete run through of the steps you need to ensure for the responsible sourcing of gold. The first is establishing an effective governance system. Next is assessing the supply chain risk involved. Third is managing the risk of the supply. Fourth is the independent third-party audit. And fifth and final is the annual reporting. Let's see one by one each step in detail. Establishing an effective governance framework. Now the foundation and everything, whenever we talk about anti-money laundering, drills down to only one thing, which is due diligence. Now, due diligence is a continuous ongoing process on the go. If an adequate customer due diligence or a KYC is in place, maximum of the problem is solved. Now, let's talk about basics when it comes to due diligence. Right from having the information about the shareholders, the stakeholders, the UBO, the ultimate beneficiary owners, whether these stakeholders or the UBO or probably the board of directors are PEP, which is politically exposed persons, whether the entity from which you're sourcing the gold is subject to any high jurisdiction area, or do they have correct mining licenses? Are there memorandum and legal agreements in place? What if you receive or you're importing gold from countries where vernacular languages are used and the documentation is available in vernacular languages? Probably in due diligence, we test, check, verify all the complete KYC of the source from where the gold is sourced. Coming to the sourcing of gold would be one more check would be having look at whether the country from where you're sourcing the gold is conflict affected or high risk area, which is predetermined by the Ministry of Economy. Also, whether these countries from where you're importing gold, do they have any adverse media sanctions, or have they been blacklisted or banned before in doing such activities? The next step would be analyzing the roles and responsibilities as a regulated entity yourself. Towards that, the first primary responsibility would be having a proper documentation process of the employees, the management, the board of directors who are part of assessing this supply chain risk, giving them advice, and having a written documented policy is more what is emphasized in the guidance. Written documented policy wherein you talk about how you're going to establish this effective governance framework. Now, when we speak about anti-money laundering, the first thing which clicks to our mind is a compliance officer. Of course, you need to have a compliance officer role designated, And the compliance officer could be a board of director or equivalent and should be directly reporting to the CEO of the regulated entity. Now, the compliance officer shall be responsible to monitor, to assess, to improvise, to guide on the latest updates of the legislation via the training program, and keep updating these to the existing employees and the management who are part of this sourcing of gold process. Also, a compliance officer responsible to strengthen the company engagement with the gold supplying counterparties, and a grievance mechanism should be part of this effective governance framework. When we talk about grievance mechanism, the employees or the management who are part of this process should be easily able to act upon or give us a warning system, or they should be able to report any kind of misconduct if they come to know during this process easily to the compliance officer and then to the CEO. Well, right from the due diligence to the roles and responsibilities to the compliance officer to the management is all which is forming part of an effective governance framework. Now, if the regulated entity has this effective governance framework in place, most of the thing is done. So step one, done for establishment of an effective framework. Next, identification and assessment of the supply chain risk. Once we have a governance in place, the next step would be identifying and assessing the risks involved in this responsible sourcing of gold. Now, there are a lot of factors where you can identify the potential risks, and I have tried to jot down a few pointers from the long guidance itself to make it a little easy to understand. Let's see what are those factors which can probably help you in identifying potential risks involved in this supply chain of responsible sourcing of gold. Well, the first one would be counterparty risk factors, which means the suppliers you're dealing with, are they identified as PEPs, or do they have complex ownership structure? Do they have a correct size of mining licenses? Are they legal enough to practice sourcing of gold? Whether they have any media listing findings? These could be forming part of your counterparty risk factors, wherein you thoroughly analyze the background of the suppliers and the importers you're dealing with. Next would be geographical risk factors. Now, geographical risk factors takes us to the types of gold. So whether gold is in a mined gold format, mined gold, which means gold is directly originating from mine, whether it is in a scrap gold format, which means it is being used over a period of time and now you're sourcing that scrap gold geographically, whether it is a recyclable gold. Now, a recyclable gold is a point where gold is now taken back to its origin from where you bought it. Now, these geographical risk factors are also would help us in identifying the potential risks, whether the gold involved is legal enough and thorough enough to be imported. Next in line would be transaction risk factors. Now, transaction risk factors would take us to a major concern here, that whether this transaction of importing or sourcing of gold is subject to excessive cash. Okay, when we say excessive cash, we need to have in mind that not always we are allowed, or the countries where you're dealing with are allowed to deal in excessive cash when it comes to dealing with gold. So this could be a primary starting point to analyze the transaction risk factor. Also, if you feel that whether the gold is being dealt with inconsistency in the transaction volume, so the volume is inconsistent and the gold which you're using or you're importing, whether this transaction is subject to a third party transportation channel or a digital channel which you're going to use. So whether this transaction is legitimate in throughout the channel, right from the origination till the gold reaches you, that could be determined in the transaction risk factors. Next in line would be identifying the product risk. Now, product would be whether it's an ASM gold or an LSM gold, which means it is an artisanal small mining gold, or is it a large scale mining gold? What is the concentration of the carat of the gold? Is it matching to the norms and regulations which are predefined? So these could be the product risk factors which you can try to identify while you're sourcing the gold. Next would be delivery channel risk factors. While I was speaking of the delivery channel, sometimes physical delivery or face-to-face or hand-on-hand delivery is being used. Well, a face-to-face goal would be a low risk, but of course, when there is a delivery chain involved and you have third-party transportation involved, probably we need to analyze the transaction, the delivery channel of the same. We need to also ensure that security practices are in place when it comes to packaging or sourcing logistically, whether this delivery channel is authenticate enough and is being subject to proper KYC and documentation. That would be useful in analyzing your delivery channel risk factors. Next would be location based red flags. Now, I was already speaking about the location based. For example, if the countries are subject to adverse media sanctions. Now, what happens if you're sourcing gold from a country which has any export import regulations for gold? Have you ever looked upon on to the legality of these regulations, which is forming part of your supplier country? Also, whether the gold which you're originating from a location, whether they are allowed and they have an international approval of dealing with the import and export of gold. Also, to remember, in the location based red flag would be the gold you're originating from, the organization or the supplier you're dealing with is not involved in any kind of money laundering, corruption, or is not using any kind of bribery, human trafficking, which means it's not a blood gold, it is actually gold. So all of these factors need to be analyzed when you're checking the red flags of a location based importer. Next would be supplier red flags. Now, when you're identifying and assessing suppliers, coming back to the due diligence and KYC, probably all of that is done. What if you're still importing the gold and you're sourcing the gold from the same supplier, but right now the supplier is having different beneficial owners, the organization structure has changed, and the supplier is not keeping up consistently and doesn't have policies and procedures in place? So a continuous due diligence needs to be followed and needs to be checked upon. And anytime if you feel there is a supplier red flag, probably you've identified and assessed that there is a supply chain risk involved right here. This was step 2 of the guidance. Let's see what do we have in step 3. Okay, step 3 is the management of the supply chain risk. Once you've identified, you've assessed, and now you've known via those factors that you've already analyzed and you found out the risk, what do we have next and how do we manage the supply chain risk? Well, the guidance says that the regulated entity should have a devised risk management strategy and a risk control plan, that whether you've identified, now you have to document the risks, you have to mitigate the risks, and a continuous monitoring needs to be done. Now, firstly, the regulated entity should establish on a continuing basis. As I said, you need to continuously assess your supplier, whether the suppliers are involved in any of the illegal activities, because we are sourcing gold from there. Now, continuous monitoring is required when you're identifying and assessing these risks. Now, clearly, management is responsible along with the compliance officer. Now, the guidance emphasizes on whether when you identify and assess and you've come down to a conclusion that there is a significant risk involved and you're exposed to some kind of risk, a senior management reporting system should be in place. When if you've already found out that there is some illegality involved, immediate termination of the engagement is expected, immediate disengagement is expected, and the senior management reporting needs to be done every 3 months. So the guidance emphasizes this senior management reporting to be done every 3 months, which means it's an ongoing, continuing process that once you've established the governance framework, now you're going to continuously identify and keep identifying and assessing the risks, and you keep reporting them every 3 months. Now, when it comes to senior management reporting, what is expected out of this report? Probably what are the high risks factors, what are the low risks factors, what are the medium risks factors. Again, coming back to high risk would be if you find out that the UBO is inappropriate, if there's a PEP involved, or the organization or the supplier is connected closely with a PEP. All these factors could form part of your senior management reporting. Well, I would repeat myself, the senior management reporting needs to be done at least 3 months on an ongoing process and continuously. Now, once we have the management and the reporting in place, we need to have an independent third party audit for these due diligence measures. Of course, via due diligence and the documentation, we are confident enough that we have the policies and procedures in place. However, involving a third party audit for due diligence measures is emphasized in the guidance. Now, what do you mean by having an audit plan and having an audit implementation? Um, the guidance says you need to have an independent auditor in place. Now, of course, we know that the independent auditor should have basic principles of audit, which means independence, competence, and needs to be accountable enough. Also, the list of the accredited reviewers who can take part and who can participate and who are already approved shall be published on the Ministry of Economy website. So you will always have a list of reviewers readily available on the Ministry of Economy website who can help you in this third party audit. Also, the law emphasizes that you cannot be a third party auditor to a regulated entity if you've already given them some kind of consultancy in the past 12 months. Of course, we understand the background and the most important principle of an audit is the independence principle, but it is clearly mentioned in the guidance and the legislation that probably the auditor cannot conduct an independent third party audit if it can be proved that in the past 12 months, the auditor was involved in any kind of consultancy given to the regulated entity. That's why it's very important to have an independent third party audit. It is needless to say that the auditor should be well versed and should be having experience and should be aware of the gold procurement practices and needs to be specialized in the same field. The next step would be annual reporting on these due diligence measures. Once you have the legal governance framework in place, you've identified and assessed the risk, you've managed the risk, you have been having an auditor on board. The last step would be submitting the annual reports within like in the 12 months report to the Ministry of Economy on these due diligence measures which you've been doing. Now, remember, this is annual reporting, which means continuous reporting. It's not a one-time exercise. So as a regulated entity and as you have a third-party auditor in place, it is always important to have right management systems in place. It is always important to list down and document the risk assessments. No matter if it's a low risk or a medium risk, it is always important to have the policy and the risks identified and documented in place. And of course, while we were discussing on how do we manage the risks, it is probably most important factor to have a risk control plan once you've identified this. And through these, you can now have all of these form part of your annual reporting. So all of this can form part of your annual report and then could be submitted to Ministry of Economy. I would just like to highlight one thing here. The regulated entity at the end is responsible for undertaking all these measures and is responsible for the entire process when it comes to sourcing of gold, dealing with gold, continuous importing of gold. Because gold itself, as I said, is extremely volatile and it is extremely attractive and easily used for criminal financing, hidden networks, and terrorism financing, child trafficking. A lot of factors are involved. So ultimately, it's the responsible of the regulated entity to have all these measures in place, and not to forget that it's an ongoing process. So every 3 months, a senior management reporting is expected, and annually, audit report is expected by the Ministry of Economy. So now we understand the seriousness of the legislation and the guidance coming out when it comes to the responsible sourcing of gold. I hope I was pretty clear till now. I would like to take a minute to thank you everyone for patiently listening to me.